Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this week's edition of Sisters Corner, the topical show where we talk about issues of interest to Muslim women, all people actually, and anyone who's interested in understanding a bit more about their role in society and the challenges that we have facing us at the moment. This week I'm particularly privileged to have with me two amazing women who I've known for quite a long time and who do fantastic work in their own spheres. We've got with us Penny Wangari-Jones from West Yorkshire Racial Justice Network, and Vilu Sandhu, who works and lives in Bradford and is a community activist and has been particularly active around the rights of EU citizens over the last couple of years post the EU referendum. So welcome both of you. Thank you so much for taking time out to come and talk to us about the important issue of hate crime, and particularly we're interested in what it is and what we can do about it. And I know both of you've got personal experience and you've been very aware of lots of other people's experience as well. So I know I just briefly introduced you, but do you just want to say a little bit about yourselves?
So hello, and yes, I am V. I am an EU citizen myself. I'm French, and I've lived in the UK for 18 years, and I've been involved in the communities working with all migrants and lately in particular with EU citizens.
Fantastic, thank you. And Penny?
Yeah, and I'm Penny. Like you said, I work with the Racial Justice Network, and mainly majority of our work is really like working with marginalised communities who are struggling partly with hate crime, but mainly a lot of the work is around race and having race analysis and kind of springboarding from there. So whether it's race, then gender, race, then migration or faith or whatever. And it's a network of organizations who are interested in this area, but also individuals as well who want to either get skilled up, want to get connected, want to reach out to others. So yeah, basically.
Mm-hmm. And you're also, I mean, we will talk about this later, but you're also internet famous, aren't you? Because I believe that your video about how to disrupt hate crime and racist activities was, last time I saw it, was 23 million. So how many views has it had?
35 million.
35
I think the last
million.
time I heard as well, yeah. So I'm not sure what it is right now.
Okay, super. So, well, we're truly honoured to have such a famous person amongst famous person with us at the moment. So we're here to talk about hate crime. Just so our viewers are aware, what do we mean by the term hate crime?
God, there's lots of analogies, because I think hate crime is where crime is something's happened, where it's either causing somebody harm, whether it's verbal, kind of mentally or physical. But hate incidents are the smaller stuff that builds up to that. So I know V's obviously going to talk about something that's more recent, but the changes and the fact that there has been a really sharp rise in hate incidents and hate crime means for us and for communities or vulnerable communities living out there, it's people living in fear, people feeling very unsafe, but people also not necessarily knowing what to do or where to go. So some of what we have been trying to do is encourage people to report, but also ask the authorities to take the reports more seriously, because I worked with people who've been here 5 years who didn't know that they could report verbal assault and that's because they thought the only thing that you can ring the police for is if somebody's physically hit you or done something like that. So some of it is basically the incidents that kind of in the long run kind of have an impact on your well-being, but it's also asserting your rights as well by wanting to be safe and live in the communities that you live in freely.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add it regarding, hate crime is, any crime or incident to that is aimed at someone who has, I think it's one of the 5 characteristics, so it can be disabled, ethnicity, nationality, religion, I'm forgetting one.
Gender.
To gender as well.
And
so, yeah.
Sexual orientation as well.
Yeah, there's quite a few.
There is quite a few, yeah.
And it is taken very seriously in this country because it is actually a crime, as you say. And other crimes, if there is a racial element or a homophobic element, can therefore result in a more grievous, you know, or a longer sentence if it does get to that point. So it is really important that people, when they describe what happens to them, describe it in its fullest sense. And I think the other angle to hate crime is it can be about perceptions as well. Yeah. So it doesn't have to be, someone doesn't have to say some terrible, horrible N-words, P-words, whatever, but if you perceive that someone is behaving that way with you because of your race, religion, you know, sexual orientation, then that in itself can be reported as a hate crime. And then, like you say, there are those hate incidences which may not meet that threshold, but, you know, collectively over time, so it is still worth keeping records, etc., of those sort of what appear smaller but can also be just as, like you say, damaging. And the other thing is, I think with hate crime, really key point is there can be third-party reporting. Yeah. Yeah. So actually, if you two had an incident between you and I observed it and I thought that it was a hate crime based on whatever, you may decide, Penny, you're not going to do anything about it, but I could report it and say, actually, I've just witnessed a horrendous hate incident, and etc. So I think those are really quite key points to point out. Yeah. But I think one of the huge things for us to think about today a little bit is there seems to have been a huge spike, exponentially almost, in the last couple of years in hate crime, and yet we still feel that's underreported. So if there's been this huge spike, and I mean hundreds of percent spike, not 1 or 2%, and then on top of that, it's still underreported. I mean, I must say it boggles my mind as to how much really must be going on. So what should we be doing then? You know, why do you think this spike in hate crime over the last few years?
For me, again, and we talk about this quite a lot at the Racial Justice Network, there is a lot of it is driven by the government and policy, which is a shame, because also government and policy are also coming up and saying there is hate crime, talk to the police. So if we think of, for example, the migration policies and how they exist and what impact that they have, it is coming from the top. But same again goes to the, you know, politicians. We were talking about earlier about Boris Johnson, but people like UKIP and the damage that UKIP managed to do and leave behind, even though they didn't get that many people in government, they shifted the conversation and the policies very much to the right. And that for me is the fear, because what maybe 10 years ago you would have thought is unheard of, now you hear and you hear it again and again, and you're hearing it from the politicians. So I think and the same with Trump. So there is like an appeal that's kind of started happening as time's gone by, and these people were being pulled into that. So if the politicians can say, you know, even Cameron talked about Swarm, but if they can say that, imagine what else somebody who's even more far right than that can say. So
what you're saying is people in, you know, public roles, in leadership positions, in some sort of policy, you know, they could be perceived as being anti certain groups of people or disfavouring certain groups of people.
Yeah. And then the community kind of takes that up. So around Brexit, what we did say is, and because again we've worked around race and activism around race and organising communities, and we've been saying racism exists and it's there, and people are saying, yeah, but we're post-racial and all that. But I think it's because it was very subtle. It has been subtle. What we did see around Brexit and the conversations, the way it happened, was most people felt legitimised, and also that racism kind of became very visible. So if it's telling people in the streets and telling them to go back where they come from and things like that, that is kind of no longer like as shocking as it was. But what was more concerning is the fact that people have also normalised and accepted that behaviour. So we talked about the video. And I remember precisely around Brexit what it felt. And one of a person who volunteered at Racial Justice was from Greece, and she came in the following morning in tears saying, do I need to go? And for me, and I mean, I talk about I'm black and that's kind of visible, but I've never realised the impact it had on other people, just that whole Brexit. And I know Vi will get into it after, but at the same time, I was going into spaces where, again, I work a lot with people who've recently migrated here, so people seeking asylum and refugees. And I remember that same week, having a conversation with some guys who were having physical fights in the streets, and then asking them what they're doing about it, and they said nothing, because also that's what you get as a foreigner. So they'd also accepted. So if one guy wanted to go to the shop to buy anything, he couldn't just get up and go. He needed to get other people from his house to go with him, because they know what's going to happen when you go outside. But then at the same time, we're talking with the police, and the police were saying it's not as bad as it feels. But then also talking to other groups, were saying, what do we do? My neighbour said this, and this is like friends who are white. My neighbour said this, what should I do? And that's when I kind of sat down and thought, actually, what would I do? Because I've experienced a lot of stuff myself, but as a person who's experienced it, what would I want somebody to do? And that's where I came up with the 5 ways to disrupt racism. And I think the point you made about asking people to report it, because usually the onus is left to the person who's experienced it to go and report it. And what we're saying is, if you've already been through that experience of somebody saying, spitting or whatever, and then you also have to bottle it and then go and try and report it, it's quite overwhelming. And I know, again, we will get into it. So some of it is saying, actually, it'd be really good if somebody can report on behalf. So if you witness something between me and you, because you don't know whether I'm going to go report it, if you add that report on top of that, but also recording it and asking, because what I was really saying to people is not to be bystanders, but also not to just focus on the very violent forms of racism, because there is the subtleness like exists even in our workplaces where, you know, one colleague says and does something to others. So it's really encouraging people to remember that we're all human and we exist in this society or communities together, but we also need to be looking out for each other continuously.
So we're going to talk a bit more later in the show about what we can do to support each other, and, you know, your video about the 5 ways to disrupt sort of hate crime or racism is really useful, and we'll discuss that in a bit more detail. So one of the things you said for the rise of hate crime is, you know, leadership and politicians and leaders from around the world. It's not just the UK. There seems to be a little bit of a shift towards somehow normalising racism, and one of the terms you used was post-racial. Could you just quickly tell me what that means?
How do I say it without kind of really using bad words? We're not post-racial. So if we are post-racial, some of what we're seeing and experiencing right now won't be happening. So the way we see it, so for example, the vision...
Is it, if, pardon me, sorry, is it, if we were post-racial, race would not be an issue, we wouldn't be experiencing racism, and people would be able to have equal opportunities, equal rights, and it wouldn't matter what colour skin they have or what religion they have. Yeah, that doesn't sound like a place we're in at the moment.
We're not there yet, no. And I think it's the fact, and I think also there is, capitalism is one of the biggest drivers as well. I know we talked about politicians and that whole divide and inequality that exists, and also feeling like some people are scapegoated to being told the other ones were on the wrong, the other ones were driving racism and stuff, and it isn't. So it's kind of really looking and recognizing there is difficulty. I mean, we're in Bradford, look at the deprivation, and this is not pointing at one specific community as such. So when things are that bad, when things are that horrible, people feeling disconnected, either to the system, feeling disconnected to the powers, feeling disconnected just generally, they're going to look for some answers, and they're going to try and tear out something. And usually people go for the most vulnerable people who are more vulnerable than themselves. So for me, yeah, we're not post-racial, but it's also recognizing the times you're in, austerity measures, people like can't even find work, or all the cuts in benefits and everything else.
So yeah, all of those things factor. The other thing, V, and I'd be interested in your opinion here, is what role do you think the media has had in stoking hate crime in this country and around the globe?
Well, giving a platform. They've got a huge responsibility. I mean, it's been years and years and years, even before the referendum, you know, talking the way they were talking about asylum seekers, refugees, you know, the swarm of migrants, etc. So yeah, it's been there for a long time. It seems to have gone worse in the last couple of years. But yeah, they definitely do have a responsibility for you know, being in the minds of people and
drip feeding them negativity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, interestingly enough, I was just thinking when I was looking at us three, so I was saying, you know, obviously we're all women, and then interestingly, Penny and I are very visible minorities, you know, obviously for skin colour, but in my case, obviously I wear a hijab, so that at the moment draws a lot of attention, and as you know, there's a lot of Islamophobic hate crime, and particularly aimed at women because it's so visible. Now, you know, someone could look at you and say, well, actually, you're white, European, so what possible, you know, hate crime could you experience? But that's not the case, is it? So if you wouldn't mind, would you just tell us a little bit about what happened to you?
Yeah, I mean, just before going on to it, the only thing I would say is, yeah, certainly I do have, you know, what we call white privilege, etc. I mean, specifically for my family, who's obviously I do have two children that are dual heritage, and they also have, you know, sometimes you know, we spoke about ethnicity, nationality, but also the status it can play into it. So like, for example, with my children, I've got a mother who's an EU national and their dad is a refugee, so which has stigmas as well, you know, added to it. I mean, the incident that happened to myself and my youngest son happened in April this year. I mean, there's been many other incidents that were incidents, not crime. And the one in April was actually a crime. And I'm quite active in the community, so I had been in London with my youngest son. And so we were on our way back to Bradford on the second leg of the journey. And
were you promoting your book in Limbo? Was that what you were doing in London that weekend?
No, that day I was there for I'm part, we'll speak about it after, but I'm part of In Limbo, and I'm part of something called the 3 Million, which campaign for the guarantee of the rights of EU nationals. And I was doing a speech there regarding some work I've done with writing to all the consulars in Bradford in asking them to support local EU nationals. So yeah, we were on the way back and just talking to each other. I was speaking in English, obviously with a slight accent, but yeah, you know, not doing much. Because I had been doing a speech, I had two quite big badges that were clearly showing that I was an EU national, that I'd not taken off for whatever reason. Should be able to
wear a badge.
A badge anyway. And it was quite full. It was a Saturday afternoon, and 4 men, you know, last minute who came on the carriage, and they were quite loud, quite
inebriated, but maybe drink involved.
Yeah, you know, probably. It's difficult to say, but yeah. And they all sat. So I was sat there, and my son was sat opposite me, like you are, and they came and sat all around, so not together. So there was some on my left, and one just behind me, and the other one in diagonal, which was all a bit weird anyway. And then they kept looking. So one of them in particular kept standing up, looking at me, sitting back down again, which, I mean, I saw him, but, you know, I was talking to my son and just minding my own business, I guess. And just at some point, he stood up and walked towards me and grabbed my head and turned the head, you know, towards him and shouted, "No surrender." Now, the first thing I thought about, because I did some work, you know, before, was EDL, and it really, I mean, the fact that it came on, you know, in my private space, that he grabbed me, it wasn't
physically
friendly.
Assaulted you by holding you, yeah.
And you know, with what he said, you know, obviously, yeah, I was quite distressed, and then he sat himself next to me and looked at my son, and I won't say here, but he said a racial slur towards my son, who's dual heritage, and then with his hand, he put his hand on the top of my son's head, and And yeah, so my son stayed calm at that point, but I think it was adrenaline, you know, and things. He then was looking at my son, still saying the same racial slur, asked my son to, so I didn't ask, he asked her to, how to call it, he asked my son to shake his hand. My son did it, and we discussed it after, but obviously it was out of fear because he didn't know how he would react if he refused.
Didn't do it, yeah.
And then he repeated again the racial slur, and so he said the racial slur and then said, "People like you, we push from them out of the UK." And then he stood up, and whilst he was walking away, turned back at me, and he said that people like me, they would trolley them out of the UK. I mean, it was said, it's me using the wrong wording, he was shouting, but yeah, it's I think the incident sounded like it lasted ages. I mean, it did last all the way from Leeds to Shipley.
So that's a 15-minute ride, isn't it?
Yeah, 10 to 15 minutes. Yeah. His friends were saying words as well, but because he was threatening to me, my ears was only listening to him rather than paying attention, you know, fully to what they were saying, because obviously my son, you know, were there. When he stood up to a young girl, this is the only person who intervened, a young girl in her 20s that came and sat next to me with her back to the men. And they started to then say some, you know, inappropriate comment towards her. Yeah. So it was quite difficult.
It sounds terrible, and I know I read about it, and I've heard about it, and I think it's absolutely disgusting in this day and age that, you know, you and your son can't be on public transport and, you know, feel perfectly safe doing so. Just for our viewers' sake, you might imagine that this could be, you know, like young people, a little bit drunk, maybe a bit too high-spirited, but these were older gentlemen, weren't they?
Yeah, they were in their 50s. Yeah, middle-aged men.
And I know age doesn't always bring wisdom, but you would hope, you know, it brings a little bit more sense than that.
Yeah, and I mean, they clearly felt, well, I guess entitled to the word, and like no fear, and I mean, well, like I say, apart from that young lady, nobody, I didn't, I mean, I have to say, I did, you know, my vision was mainly on the guy, so I didn't look at people's faces, but I didn't hear any, you know, gasp or, you know, noise
Nobody
from
was
anyone.
Yeah.
People were not getting involved. So I think, I mean, it felt extremely lonely, you know, up until
it
at least.
Sounds terrifying, you know.
It did, yeah.
Because it's not that he was just saying stuff to you. It was actually, I mean, I've been in situations where people say stuff around you and you don't know if it's quite directed at you or not. That feels threatening enough because you suspect it is, but you can't quite know. But here, you know, it was very direct, very towards you, and actually physically he was not only crowding your space, but he was touching you, you know, and your child as well. So, you know, I can't see, I mean, that's just frightening, isn't it?
It was, extremely frightening. I mean, the young lady asked us, you know, if we wanted to get off at a stop. It was in Shipley, and which obviously we did. I mean, and that's when you know, after the adrenaline, after the event, that's when maybe the realization that what's just happened. I mean, my young, you know, my son who went into complete meltdown at that point. Sorry. So, yeah, it was quite difficult.
And distressing because, you know,
yeah,
worrying about yourself and your safety is bad enough, and then after worrying, you know, with your child there as well. So you got off at Shipley, and this young woman got off with you there as well. Yeah. What did you do next, Vi?
I mean, when I was in Shipley, I mean, the young lady had to go, and I mean, at that point, I didn't even think of getting a contact details or anything. I just obviously was looking after my son, and literally called a taxi, went home. So at that point, the first thing I wanted to do is be home, be safe.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
that's how it felt. But as soon as I got home, then I contacted British Transport Police and reported the incident.
And were they good? Did they take you seriously?
On the phone, it felt actually that they took me seriously at that point, and they told me actually that someone would come and get the written statement on the Sunday. So which, you know, I mean, it was about 9:30 in the evening when I got home, so you know, it was fair enough. And yeah, they straight away they took the old statement. They even asked me about you know, what the people looked like, which I mean, I only could recall the main guy because of how I went to, but actually my son had a really good recollection of the other guys because of where he was sat, on some of the guy were sat behind me. So he was, he was able to give a lot of information. So the issue is on the Sunday, then they never came.
So you ended up having a bit of an ordeal with the police as well.
Yes.
Over time, didn't you?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to paraphrase a little bit because we're going to go to a break shortly.
No problem.
So they did start taking you more seriously. What was it that got you to that point?
I took it to the newspaper, and I also got support from Racial Justice, from Penny, from Racial Justice Network, who was able to give them a bit of a nudge, and that's when they started to take seriously. And also, once they did get the CCTV, and I did also an appeal where I was able to find the young lady who helped me on the train and who decided to give us a statement.
Great. So we're going to go for a quick break, and when we come back, we'll just talk about what happened next.